The following review for Catherine contains spoilers for the entirety of the game, including several of the endings. If you haven't played Catherine, then I advise you not to watch this review until you've done so. There's also plenty of strong language and sexual content, so those with easily offended sensibilities, get out. I should preface this review by saying that I've never played a Persona game in the past, which is made by the team behind this game. I honestly don't think that matters, considering how different the two games seem to be, but I thought I'd say so anyway in the interest of full disclosure. In fact, I didn't have a whole lot of interest in playing Catherine either until I sat down and watched somebody else play the first hour or so of the game. I found myself getting invested in the story and decided it would be best to start it up myself rather than ruin the experience. So that's how I came to be playing Catherine, which for those not in the know is a very unique hybrid. Half visual novel, half block puzzle game. It focuses on the relationship of the protagonist named Vincent and the two women in his life, both called Catherine, one with a K, the other with a C. The game starts out with a framing device. Midnight Venus, who is essentially a red afro-headed version of Elvira, introduces us to the concept of the game as though it's an episode of The Golden Playhouse, a fake TV show. This also means that you spend a large portion of the game with a Golden Playhouse watermark in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. It's a bizarre, unexpected intro to the game and immediately had me wondering if maybe the Persona team are planning on producing more games with the Golden Playhouse intro. Anyway, the game throws us into the puzzle section to begin with. It's an easy stage, being interrupted by both Steve and the narrator to give the player tips. The interruptions really hamper the enjoyment of this first section of gameplay, but at least it's a thorough introduction to the concept of climbing the blocks, which turns out to be important because this game is quite difficult. Thus begins the first day of Vincent's life. First thing that struck me right away was the fact that the voices were in English. Now, I don't know why it took me this long to realise, considering I had played the first level and watched Midnight Venus introduce the game. Maybe I'd been drinking or something. Speaking of which, actually,
I know this is sudden, but here's some trivia about beer, now that you've emptied your mug. It's said that glass shape and pour style has much to do with how much foam you get. But there is another factor. It's the cleanliness of the glass. Even a tiny bit of oil or dust will affect the beer's surface tension, making it less foamy. This means that it's not a good thing to wipe a wet beer glass with a dry cloth. Rinse the glass with hot water and turn it over to let it air dry. And please try this out. And that was the beer trivia for tonight.
the style of the cutscenes, both in-engine and out, resemble an anime, and while I would hardly call myself any kind of expert on the issue, I've watched enough animes to know that I prefer the Japanese audio. Actually, watching any anime in English is usually enough to learn that going with subtitles is a better idea than subjecting your ears to the torment of high-pitched American voices trying to sound like kawaii schoolgirls. As soon as the game gave me a chance, I scrambled to go into the options and turn on the Japanese audio instead, except you can't. Now look, I'm not expecting to be able to play every Japanese release with the original audio. I certainly can't understand Japanese. My knowledge of the language begins and ends with the word bukake. I'm not delusional as to think it's a worthwhile inclusion for most games, it's not. But we all know the type of people that are going to buy this game. Hardcore gamers who aren't adverse to the anime stylings of the story. This lends credence to the idea that they might have watched a couple of animes in their time and they might prefer the Japanese audio. No matter how good a voice actor is, their delivery is going to suffer when they're dubbing over something else. That said, after about 10 minutes of story, I was willing to accept the English audio as it's a pretty damn good dub. Vincent in particular gives a very natural sounding performance in a lot of places, not something I was expecting from a dubbed anime. It still suffers regularly throughout the game, however, due to the character's animations not quite syncing up with the speech, and I'm not just talking about the lips. It's hard to put into words, but there's often something simply wrong about the way the characters move their body in relation to their speech. An unfortunate side effect of the dubbing, and one that could have easily been sidestepped were the original audio on the disc. This first day mainly introduces us to Vincent and Catherine. While both of their personalities come across quite well, I find the way the game treats their relationship to be intrinsically cheap. They sit on opposite sides of the table, never make physical contact, and basically never have a single moment where they look at ease with each other or enjoy themselves. It feels as though the game unfairly stacks the deck against Catherine right from the get-go. In fact, one of the nastier little tricks the game pulls is when you use the texting feature. If you open up a text from Catherine, you hear a sigh, whereas opening up a text from Catherine is accompanied with a giggle. Here's the crux of the situation. If both of the girls had equally enjoyable personalities, and were equally attractive, and seemed to have an equally good time with Vincent, there would be no game. The only way to create the conflict is by portraying the relationship with Catherine as being sour, and making Catherine sexier. I can't think of any other way the scenario really could have been done, but it winds up feeling a bit more simple than it should. On the plus side, this does allow the game to effectively trap you between the two. On my first playthrough, I tried to play as true to life as I could manage, and although Sea Athrun is very alluring, I couldn't quite bring myself to be a bastard to K Athrun either, so I wound up stuck in the middle, something I imagine a lot of people would be if they played the game using their own frame of mind. The story usually plays out in the same fashion over the course of several days. We see some cutscenes and then we're allowed to wander around the bar. Vincent's friends are regulars there. There's Johnny, the somber, quiet guy, Erica, the barmaid, who's like a sexy, big-titted version of Ronald McDonald, Orlando, who inexplicably thinks wearing a hat is something men can do without looking like dickheads, and Toby, who loses his virginity at the age of 23, only somewhat more pathetic than myself.
I know this is sudden, but here's some trivia for you, as you seem to have finished your glass. It's said that chugging alcohol isn't good for you, but sometimes it's necessary. The cocktail Nikolashka is an example of this. It uses cognac, lemon, coffee, and sugar. But first, you put the lemon, coffee, and sugar in your mouth. Then you take a big swig of cognac. Of course, you can't even talk until you drink it all. It's necessary to chug it. But cognac contains 40% alcohol, so those with low tolerances should not attempt this. And that was the cocktail trivia for tonight.
You have the option of getting Vincent drunk while you're hanging out too, and finishing a drink results in an interruption from the narrator who rewards you with some trivia about the drink you just finished. This is one of my favourite little touches in the game, and I found myself knocking back drinks just to get to the next interesting fact about beer. There are several other bar patrons you can chat to as well, an arcade game to play, and a jukebox you can use to change the music in the bar. A lot of the tracks in the game are remixes of classical orchestral pieces, and although I'm usually the first one to cringe at a remix of any music, let alone something classical, I really enjoyed the soundtrack in the game. So much as to say that maybe it was my favourite thing about Catherine. It's certainly the only part of the game I unambiguously love. Roaming around the bar and chatting to people is more enjoyable than I expected. I think I put this down in large part to two main factors. Firstly, it's hard to discern the intricacies of their stories in a single playthrough, and it would take quite a lot of perseverance or luck to keep all 5 of the main side characters alive on your first go. This makes the subplots very rewarding for multiple playthroughs, as you see different outcomes of keeping various people alive or letting them die. Secondly, there's a big disconnect in most games when it comes to chatting with random NPCs. A lot of the time your character is tasked with some monumental, time-critical burden, and it strains the suspension of disbelief that they'd have the time to wander around and chat to some peasant about the weather. Vincent, on the other hand, isn't under any such pressure, and it makes total sense for him to spend as much time as he likes having a good time and some drinks in the bar each night. Inevitably though, Vincent's got to go to sleep, and that's when the nightmares start. If you've never played Catherine before, allow me to give you an idea of what the gameplay is like for a beginner. Catherine is a very difficult game to start out in. The complexity of the puzzles ramps up significantly in the first few stages, and it resulted in quite a few deaths early on for me. In fact, the initial Japanese release was deemed too hard, so an undo button was put in the normal mode for the North American and European releases. In the Japanese version, only easy mode gets the chance to undo anything. Initially, my pride prevented me from pressing the undo, but I have to admit that I ended up resorting to it a lot as I adjusted to the game's mechanics. Not only is it very hard to predict the ramifications some moves might have for a new player, but the controls have a habit of causing Vincent to do totally unintended things. It's revealing that the game tells you how to move using the directional buttons rather than the analog stick. The game controls a lot better this way. I can't remember the last time I had to play a game with the D-pad though, so I naturally defaulted my thumb to the analog stick until I learned better. This is a pretty poor way to control the game, and even using the D-pad doesn't cure the game from being occasionally unresponsive, or too responsive, or something. It's hard to pin down exactly what it is that's wrong with the controls. More than that though, the unreliable controls force me to take some things a fraction of a second slower than I should, just to make sure that Vincent would complete the correct move. This, combined with using the D-pad over the analog stick, forms a disappointing feeling that I'm never quite going as fast as I could be, even if I have a puzzle figured out. One thing the game deserves to be praised for is how far it pushes these puzzle mechanics. New blocks and techniques are constantly introduced to the character at a very brisk pace. The boss fights also serve to mix things up as well, even if sometimes the camera focuses too much on the superficial action, blocking you from progressing at an ideal rate. It also suffers from some pretty serious bouts of cheapness. Generally, things which introduce randomness, like the annoying AI sheep, have a detrimental effect on the gameplay, and some of the bosses have this in spades. The boss stages also stuck out for me though, because even though the game is often throwing extra dangers at you, the puzzles in these levels are often much simpler than the ones preceding them. I'm almost tempted to say their difficulty is anticlimactic, but on the flip side I'm not sure I'd want it raised so I could be stabbed over and over again by Doom's Bride. My particular favourite bosses were the Child and Child with a Chainsaw, the latter of which being exactly what it sounds like. The designs on the bosses are menacing and totally unhinged, which is a perfect fit for the game. There's nothing being held back in the gameplay department either, and you'd never get the notion that Atlas were ever saving any ideas for a sequel. Everything seems packed in here. By the end of the game, there's tons of blocks and techniques the player has been introduced to, and this isn't even counting the extra modes.
I know this is sudden, but here's some trivia about beer, now that you've emptied your mug. Beer is loved all over the world, but where did it come from? The earliest records of beer making are from 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. It's said the barley used to make bread fermented naturally, and beer was created by coincidence. The earliest known alcohol is said to be from 9,000 years ago in China, a mix of rice and fruit alcohols. I guess you could say humanity's had a long time to enjoy their drinks. And that was the beer trivia for tonight.
Rapunzel is a nice game for people less interested in the action. It poses some more difficult puzzles with the twist that there's no time limit, only a move limit. This allows a slow, well thought out approach to shine through, and with 64 stages it's a huge amount of content for an arcade game within the game. It even has multiple endings depending on whether or not you pick up some collectibles along the way. As an aside, I must say I find it baffling that the main game has continues while Rapunzel doesn't. I can't understand this decision at all. The continues in Catherine only kick you back to the last save point anyway, which means the start of the puzzle you're on, so it basically seems like a cosmetic thing more than anything else. I like that Catherine provides a challenge, but I think the inclusion of continues in games has basically turned into a hollow mechanic, which is the reason they've largely been abandoned. There's also Babel mode, which has 4 stages of increasing difficulty and randomly generated blocks. It includes some of the hardest challenges in Catherine, which is really saying something, and it's a great addition for those who've mastered the stuff in the story. You can take on Babel in co-op mode too, and while I like the option, I don't think it adds much to the game. Even at your most coordinated, it barely makes the experience of climbing blocks any faster or more streamlined than it would be normally. What this means is it's less about working together and more about staying out of each other's way and not screwing up whatever your partner is working on. Unfortunately, Babel mode's last level is so difficult it's impossible, and that's not my wounded pride talking. The level is actually impossible. For some reason, the last stage, Axis Mundi, is bugged to the point where it can't be beat. If you compare videos of the North American or European release to the Japanese one, it's clear that something is wrong. The game increases difficulty to level 2 from the get-go and starts dropping down formations of blocks meant for much later in the level immediately. The dropping of the floors below also seems to speed up to the point where it's impossible to get past around 50 floors, and Axis Mundi it has about 300. I'm playing the European release of the game myself, and this is particularly disappointing for 2 reasons. Firstly, there's a secret ending in the game, which some might even call the true ending, if you manage to beat Axis Mundi. You can still see this by beating the level in co-op, but it stings nonetheless that it's impossible to do solo. Secondly, the game has been released here about a year after it came out in the States, which means there was plenty of time to track down what was causing this issue and have it fixed for the European discs. Some fans have emailed Atlas explaining the problem, but as far as I'm aware, nobody has gotten a response. Considering how long it's been since the North American release without a comment on the issue, it'll likely never be patched. The competitive Colosseum levels are a much better addition than the co-op Babel levels. The stages can get a bit repetitive, but they definitely showcase the mode well, littering the place with traps the 2 players can use against one another. When 2 players are frantically trying to climb a tower with reckless disregard for each other, it lends itself well to the chaotic humour evident in the best multiplayer games when something unexpected befalls one of the players. Falls being the operative part of that sentence. With regards to the main section of gameplay though, I do have a few major gripes. The Inazuma technique, which allows you to make stairs in very tight spaces, is only explicitly taught 3/4 of the way through the game. It's easily the most important technique in the game and makes many of the puzzles considerably easier. It's so useful that I think where players handled it earlier, the entire layout of the game would have had to change in order to keep things challenging. Another main problem is how punishing and obnoxious it is to die in this game. There are checkpoints littered about in each stage, but the act of dying itself is wholly demoralizing. The fall sequence in particular is annoying and repetitive. It features the same audio every time, and the game almost seems to be rubbing your face in your death, which wouldn't be so bad if not for the fact that it's all too easy to experience this several times in the game due to no fault of your own. Particularly when you need to go behind an object, the camera refuses to make it easy to observe the other side of the stage, and the controls become awkwardly reversed. I'm amazed by how severe the camera issues can be in this game, considering how simple a task it should be in theory, to follow a character as they scale, for all intents and purposes, a two-dimensional playing field. I must admit that playing the block puzzles in the main story section became a chore for me at several points. The game being obnoxiously cheap, combined with the annoying death sequences, and all-around repetition of the puzzles, meant I essentially forced my way through just to get to the next section of the story, which did manage to hold my interest. There's some genuine highlights in the story, like when Catherine calls Vincent in the cafe. It's a moment when you feel like shit could hit the fan at any moment, and it raises the stakes in the story. The game pulls the same trick again to an even higher degree when Catherine opens Vincent's door in the morning and nearly catches him in the act. These moments pull you in a way that a lot of computer game stories don't, even though those stories typically have much higher stakes, like the end of the world or something preposterous like that. As I said, I did my first playthrough as true to life as I could manage. I later found out that this wishy-washy approach works best with the story. Vincent's character is almost perpetually crippled by indecision, regardless of what choices you make. Don't take my word on the matter though, let's see what Vincent has to say for himself.
Huh? Oh. Wow, no, she's just, well, oh my God! Okay.
The game had me fooled a bit on the first go around, and I was convinced the story could at least take a couple of different directions had I played it differently. I was quite wrong. The differences that occur based on how you manipulate the morality meter are extremely shallow and only really affect the ending cutscenes. In fact, I found myself hemorrhaging all respect for the story on my second playthrough as I went for the most Catherine heavy responses I could manage. I encouraged her when she sent me sexy pictures, I answered any question asked of me in the most chaotic way possible, and I brushed off every single text I received from Catherine with the worst responses the game would allow. This is what was happening to me 3/4 of the way through the story.
My nightmares were all caused by this trouble, but they forced me to realize something.
Which is?
I took everything for granted, up until now. I feel like now, I remember what I've always held dearest to me.
Sounds selfish to me.
Really?
I know, but I can't betray the person who's been with me all this time, despite who I am. I can't lose her now.
Without showing you a lot of the choices I made, it's hard to stress just how nonsensical this comes across when you actually play it. Considering the game is so focused on story, I think it's amazing they couldn't manage to create a few sequences unique to either route, and there really are only two routes. While I'm on that subject, I should touch on the game's meter used to measure your responses to certain things that happen. The game touts at the end that this wasn't a simple morality meter, it was something a bit more complex than that. Instead it charts order and chaos and which you would prefer to have in your life. Well, I for one am glad this game isn't simply about good and evil. Let's take a look at the order ending. Okay, yeah, that's good. And now the chaos ending?
You're slacking, getting kind of lazy, aren't you?
Oh, come on. It's not like there are any men out there hotter than you.
As you can see for yourself, these endings represent more than just the usual good and evil approach most games make. Clearly this is a morally intricate game, and not just good and evil. It's not just good and evil, guys. It's not just good and evil. It's not just good and evil, see? It's not just good and evil. Thankfully, although the story disappointed me enormously on the second playthrough, the gameplay became more enjoyable. It's a nice feeling to replay the puzzles when you've had a bit more experience and they aren't quite so intimidating. There's less deaths, less slowdown in the action, and all around it gave me an appreciation for just how good the mechanics actually are. The simple rules governing the blocks lead to a lot of different possible maneuvers, and skilled players can find very quick and interesting ways to climb faster. So my experience with Catherine was a very divided one. The first time through I enjoyed the story. The second time through I enjoyed the gameplay. It never quite felt like a cohesive experience, however, and that's mainly because it's not. The game itself is very divided. It's clear when the puzzles are happening and when the story is unfolding, and the two never happen at once. At the end, there's what I hope is a tongue-in-cheek explanation for the climbing sections in the game.
The stairway Vincent was forced to climb could be taken as a metaphor. It symbolized the journey to adulthood, pressuring him to make his tough life decisions. Don't you agree?
In reality, they symbolise nothing and have no gravity on the story. They're just an arbitrary challenge for Vincent to overcome and could have easily been replaced with a nightmare of a different type without impacting any of the narrative elements. This is my biggest issue with Catherine, the divide between gameplay and story. It would be easy to praise the story of Catherine as being something that hasn't been tackled in a mainstream computer game before, but I'm not sure it'd be fair to say that Catherine has done that. The story is not part of the main gameplay segments. If you needed a device to construct a story for a game and make sure that the game interfered as little as possible, then Catherine is a perfect example of that. Just make the gameplay dream sequences and then you don't have to worry about anything. Catherine doesn't deserve to be praised for handling a story that most games don't. It's an anime and a game glued together, and the story faces none of the challenges that are associated with making a game and a story work together. Most games don't bother with a story about infidelity because there's no clear way to craft gameplay around that. Rather than confront this issue, Catherine simply sidesteps it. The story deserves to be judged as a lengthy anime, and in that regard it does alright, well even, but it's far from being anything special. In the end, it's easy to poke holes in Catherine, excuse the poor phrasing. The story is too linear, the gameplay can be very frustrating, and the divide between the two is disappointing. For all its flaws though, it's hard not to enjoy Catherine. The game was so unique and pulled me in to the point where I wanted to overlook the stumbling blocks and see it through to the end. When I finally had it finished, I had no reservations about jumping back in again and playing through a different way. At the start of this review, I said I'd never played a game from this team before. Despite my problems with Catherine though, I find myself hoping that the Persona team decide to continue churning out unique games like this. I only hope they somehow manage to make them a more cohesive experience. In the end, thanks to Catherine, they've officially got my attention.
I know this is sudden, but here's some trivia about whiskey, now that you've emptied your glass. Have you ever heard of the term angel's share? During the aging process, some whiskey will be lost to evaporation. This is called the angel's share. I hear that if they seal it so it doesn't evaporate, the whiskey doesn't have that nice aroma. What a fancy way of saying it. And that was the trivia for tonight.
While we're on the topic of trivia, Eric is a man, by the way. And also that's the most shocking twist in the game, sadly.